Department, and I'd like to introduce Ryan Hebrink. Ryan Hebrink's with the City of Austin Watershed Protection Department, and he brings an environmentally focused perspective to the fight against catastrophic wildfire. With an educational background in environmental resource management and conservation, Ryan has worked for 5 years as a consulting scientist before coming to work for the city in 2011. And he is a pollution investigator and emergency spill responder. So we get to see him a lot interacting with the fire service. So we're glad of that. Early during his role with the city, while communities all around Texas were recovering from the devastating fire season of 2011, Ryan became engaged in the Austin's wildfire challenges. He's worked closely with regional agencies and interacts with local property owners to promote environmentally compatible strategies for wildfire preparation and post-fire recovery. So with that, I'd like to welcome Ryan Hebrink.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Lieutenant Anderson, and for the virtual home assessments. I think that was great for us to really get more of a hands-on feel for how these Firewise strategies can work when they're put into practice. My presentation is going to reemphasize a lot of those home hardening, structural hardening, and some of the landscape strategies that we saw in those virtual assessments, but I hope that just serves to really send those messages home. Some of the feedback that we got back from last year's Firewise landscaping training was that the content got a little repetitious, and I just want to respond to that by saying it's repetitious because I don't think it's rocket science. I think this is all pretty simple concepts. What it really comes down to is putting some thought and care and planning into this, and then I'll really harp in my presentation on the importance of diligent maintenance of that landscape and of that structure to keep it ready for that wildfire to come through and protect the home and the people that occupy the home. So again, thanks for the introduction. I'm just going to go into a little bit more background of how I got here and how watershed protection became involved. I work with the pollution prevention and reduction team at the Watershed Protection Department. And some of the core functions of this group are responding to spills that can threaten Austin's waterways and water quality in the creeks and lakes. We also investigate pollution incidents, and we permit and inspect commercial and industrial facilities in Austin for environmental compliance, regulatory compliance. You're free to jump into that PowerPoint. Thanks. Also, we administer Austin's 24/7 pollution hotlines where citizens can call in if they have any environmental concerns or witness a spill, and we'll usually be able to send out an investigator within minutes to respond to that and try to mitigate that spill accordingly. So how did we, Watershed Protection, initially get involved with this wildfire business? Well, long before wildfires became such a major community concern in our area, the Pollution Prevention and Reduction Team has been working alongside Austin Fire Department actually for decades now in that spill response capacity. So if there's a hazardous material release or perhaps a roadway accident or something along those lines, we'll respond in tandem with the fire department, where their focus is, of course, to protect public safety and restore that public safety, while our focus is to assess any impacts to the environment and waterways and try to mitigate those impacts. Then during the 2011 wildfires, that pollution hotline I mentioned was just lighting up with citizen concerns. We were getting all kinds of questions kind of in the post-wildfire, the early recovery stages, with questions like, how do I control the erosion on the burned areas of my property? We've seen in other wildfires around the country where sometimes the secondary impacts following a wildfire, the flooding and erosion, can be just as devastating and sometimes even more devastating than the fire itself. So we have in-house experts to address those erosion concerns. On public lands, we can assist with implementing erosion and sedimentation controls to stabilize the disturbed area. We were also getting questions about the firefighting water that was used, the suppression water. Is that toxic? Is it going to affect my pets that might be running around down in the creek? We also had concerns about the fire retardant that was used in the Oak Hill fire. People's homes vehicles, even their pets, their dogs, getting doused in red fire retardant, wondering, what's going to happen to my dog? What do I do? So we were very involved at that point in the 2011 season, and I think it caught everybody, the community as well as the government, somewhat unprepared, and so we realized then and there that we had a lot of work to do to get ready for the next event, especially in that community outreach and public education role. So we wanted to start then there developing some guidance, some public guidance. So we went to work developing this very comprehensive one-stop shop with localized information. I hope that everybody was able to grab one as you walked in. If you didn't, we can make sure that you get one before you go. The information in this booklet talks about wildfire risk reduction strategies to be implemented before fire, as well as the post-fire recovery guidance if we need that again, like we did in 2011. It all has a real environmental emphasis, kind of a perspective on it. And it quickly took the form of this booklet. Again, it's pretty comprehensive. I think it totals something like 50 pages. So it really digs into the nuts and bolts for those that really want to learn down to the very detailed level. While developing this public education document, we collaborated exhaustively with other agencies and subject matter experts, actually including the professional landscaping community at the Firewise landscaping event in 2012. We had a draft ready and vetted it through and got some great feedback that we did work into this final version. But we're always learning in this field. The book is we refer to as best management practices, or BMPs, but some of us also call them beginning management practices, because we really still have a lot to learn on what works and what doesn't work in this field. So we'll continue to tweak this with future editions and make adjustments as necessary. And during all the work that went into this, a lot of research, a lot of benchmarking with other fire-prone communities across the country and even across the world, we didn't find anything else out there quite like this, not anything so comprehensive or so environmentally focused. So as a city, we're pretty proud to be the first to kind of pioneer this type of effort. We try to make this public education piece user-friendly, easy to navigate. You can see each BMP, or best management practice, each topic is broken out under its own little header, and they're usually short little blurbs, a couple paragraphs that are real topic specific. Then there's table of contents in the front, so it's easy to jump around because it is so much content. We wanted to make it easy to use. So it's broken up into two major sections: before the wildfire and after the wildfire. And I really think that this is going to be an excellent resource for professional landscapers. And if you have clients that are interested in learning more about this material, you can share this with them as well. There's also a website. The website's posted on the back. It's www.austintexas.gov/wildfire-enviro-BMPs. And if you go to there, you'll find a digital version of the book that has clickable links. There's a lot of hyperlinks that are a little difficult to type in, so if you go to the website, you can just click around, and it really makes it a little bit more of a useful tool. So that's some background on how Watershed got involved in the wildfire scene initially, how our premier public education piece came to be, and with that, before we go to lunch, I'm going to jump into it and go into some detail on each of the 44 topics covered in the booklet. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that to you guys before lunch. But we will cover some of the most relevant subject matter that I think will be interesting to you. Again, some of it's going to be a re-emphasis that we saw in our virtual assessments, but the second half of my presentation taps into some fresh content that is more regulatory-based. So it's stuff that you really want to be aware of so that you're not breaking laws. So some of us around here don't realize, or we often can forget, that wildfire is a natural occurrence in Central Texas. Fire in the landscape is actually pretty important to maintain healthy, balanced, and truly natural. A lot of times people will say, oh, look, we've got this preserve or this designated natural area of some kind, but we've excluded fire from that landscape. When a fire might pop up, boom, we put it out. And that's actually not natural. So nature wants Central Texas to burn. The land all around us in Texas, it burned periodically long before we settled here. And there's going to be more fires in the future. We're going to have to live with it, and it's not going away. The native plants and animals of Texas have evolved over time to become fire adapted. They had to in order to survive, and if we want to survive, we're going to have to do the same thing too. So a fire-adapted community, they understand that we live in a fire-prone area, and fires are going to happen despite our best efforts. They understand that taking responsibility and working together is critical. And they understand that if risks to people and our structures and our infrastructure can be mitigated, then the fires don't have to be catastrophic. They're just fires. So again, our society has century-old policies in place to suppress fire in order to protect lives, our community structures, and that makes good sense. But that means that some other type of action is necessary to address that unchecked growth of brush and other hazardous fuel loads that are allowed to accumulate without that natural occurrence of fire in the landscape. We heard, I think, 70 or 80% of fire ignitions are human-caused, but without the human ignitions, we still have ignitions, lightning and other sources. So one of the ways that we can take action to address those unchecked fuel loads at the property level is to prepare our structures and the immediate surroundings with these Firewise strategies that we've already heard quite a bit about today. As professional landscapers, you all can play a critical role in helping our community implement these strategies and become fire adapted. So the risk of catastrophic wildfire in Austin is a real problem, but I hope that by the time that you leave today, you'll see that problem actually as an opportunity to help the city while growing your business as well. When I first began learning about wildfires and about ways to reduce the risk of harm from wildfires, it was in 2011 when Texas was hit hardest by fire. And initially I viewed wildfire safety and environmental protection as these two competing objectives. Like there was a give and take, a tug of war. The outcome would have to be some kind of a middle ground or compromise. And as an environmentalist and as somebody whose job it is every day to protect the environment, this is a little bit hard for me to wrap my head around. Because if you put public safety up against environmental protection, every time public safety is going to come out as the #1 priority. And that makes sense. I'm not going to argue with that. But after I'd been involved with this for a little while, attending these big multi-agency meetings and really listening, taking it in, doing some of that online research while developing the BMPs, and attending training on home ignition zone, a lot like what Lieutenant Anderson showed us in the virtual assessment. Eventually, a light bulb kind of went off that I've been looking at this wrong from the get-go. These two principles, they don't have to battle it out. They can actually work together and complement each other in a way that achieves both objectives. The key then is to aim for a landscape that is resilient and healthy. And with that, you can achieve both the wildfire safety and the environmental protection simultaneously. Again, what this requires is some thought, some planning, and lots of diligent maintenance. So how can you help your clients achieve this healthy, resilient landscape? We'll start with some fundamentals. And again, I apologize for some of the repetition, but we'll really send these messages home, I think, by the time you see this. So a Firewise property, I like to say it starts with the ridge line of the structure and it moves outward. So before you're looking at the preserve or the riparian corridor that's a mile away, that's densely vegetated, start with looking at the home. If you want to protect a home from burning, start with the home. The further you move out from the home, the less effective your actions are at protecting it. So hardening a structure should always be the first step. And you all might be wondering, why are we spending so much time focusing on structural elements when this is a landscaping class? Shouldn't we be talking about the plants and cutting the yard and that type of thing? But I've got 3 responses to that. Number one, I think that incorporating some of these basic structural elements into your existing services is feasible. It's really easy to learn, as we've seen today. I think it can expand your suite of services in a very beneficial way to your clientele. Number 2, from an environmental side, this is really easy for me to advocate because a lot of these home hardening measures have little to no impact at all on the environment. So I can always say, let's look at the home first, and then we haven't cut down any trees or done anything like that. And most importantly, these types of actions can make a huge difference in protecting the structure during a wildfire. Perhaps sometimes, depending on the setting, even more important than the actual vegetation in the yard is the structure itself. And we've heard this before, but we'll hear it again. A lot of people will envision home losses occurring during a wildfire as this wall of flames coming through the town and just consuming everything in its path. But it's mostly the embers that are the true threat. We've heard they can travel great distances, even miles, before falling and starting a new fire, typically in fine dry fuels like dry grass or a bed of leaves. I always like the firefighter joke where they say they'll take a fire, even though something as big as the Bastard fire, and they'll say, that fire started off as a little flame this big. And that's certainly true when it comes to embers falling and starting new fires. So let's look at some specific examples of home hardening. The rain gutters. At my house, my rain gutters seem to catch more leaves and debris than they do actual rain. And these dry, crispy leaves are just asking for hot embers to fall on them. So cleaning out the rain gutters is an excellent starting place to begin reducing fire risk. And after those rain gutters are cleaned, maybe your client would be interested in having some gutter guards installed. That way you won't have to come back out and clean them again in a few weeks. So maintenance is the key. If you can do anything to cut down on that maintenance, which is probably the hardest part of all this, like installing these guards, that's very helpful. So similar to the gutters, accumulating this debris, this fine material that's a fire hazard, some roof surfaces also tend to accumulate lots of leaves and debris. But this high-risk situation, it can be remedied with a ladder, a broom, maybe 5 minutes. And I don't know what kind of line item that might look on a landscaper invoice, but to me that looks like dollar signs for you all. And here again, we've talked a little bit about crawl spaces, what can happen underneath decking and that type of situation. Leaves and debris also love to collect in these areas. So as we talk about these nooks, crannies, gutters, roofs, underneath crawl spaces where this fine material likes to blow in and collect, it's an interesting concept, but that's also where the embers are going to go. It's usually the same wind patterns and pathways and obstructions that are going to guide the embers to the same places where that fine material is blowing in, which isn't good for our risk, but really sends a message home that we got to be staying on top of keeping these areas clean. Yes?
Sometimes you get these houses, they're on slopes like this, so they have a deck that goes out and comes down like 15, 20 feet or so. To cover a put fascia on that entire thing would be really expensive. Is there like a certain height at which the deck would be okay, especially if you put like river rocks underneath the deck, so at least the embers don't die?
Those are great points. Good question. So to reiterate the question, what about homes that are configured in a way where the decks are situated well above grade? So you might have a 10 or 15 or even 20-foot area underneath the deck. Would these same principles and concerns apply in that situation? And I would kind of attribute that back to vertical fuel continuity, which I'll get into in a minute, or ladder fuels that we've heard. You want to keep those areas still clean and free of material that would easily ignite. But then also when you're storing things under there, now that area might be used for storage because it is large. So just keeping in mind, firewood's probably not a good idea to put under there, or equipment, even fuel, gasoline storage.
Maybe that area is enclosed.
Right, you could screen that in, reinforcing with some non-combustible materials, heavy lumber, pressure-treated lumber, or masonry brick, something like that to hold up some screening, I think would work there. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. So here's an example of using that screening. This isn't quite the same type of metal window screening that we talked about, but I did like the look of this mesh material. So that's twofold, as we've heard before. That prevents leaves and other fine debris from blowing in, and then it also will help keep the embers out. This might not be quite as fine to keep embers out, but will go a long way to keep out leaves and debris. And it serves the same purpose like the gutter guard, but can be used a little bit more dynamically in these crawl spaces. And then This lattice work, of course, the wood lattice is not going to do a whole lot to keep the debris out from underneath. You can see it's still encroaching underneath the deck there, and of course embers are going to blow right through there. I heard Lieutenant Anderson mention 1/4 inch screen. I've also heard 1/8 inch screen is good. And then if you use something to reinforce that screen, again, wouldn't use something as combustible as this wood lattice, something non-combustible to really hold that stuff in place. All right, the importance of attic vents. We've seen some demonstrations by the Insurance, Business, and Home Safety, IBHS, something along that line, where they'll blast these structures that they built just for test purposes with embers and watch what happens. And it's just incredible how these embers will find their way into the attic. They just love to work their way right in through these vents. So screening those vents is important, again, with just the 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch metal screening. You can see the black debris in this picture, and that's all the embers that were caught and prevented from coming into the attic in this particular demonstration. So far, all these structural hardening concepts that I've mentioned have been very, very low cost, something that you can probably spin a decent profit off of. But if your client's willing to drop some more money, then we can look at some more of the heavy structural components like decking. It was news to me that composite material, that composite decking, it still does carry some fire risk. I thought it was quite a bit safer than more traditional lumber decking. I've seen some of these products advertised as being very low ignition potential, non-flammable. So perhaps they're better than the lumber, but you still want to make sure that you understand that there is risk. We're not eliminating the risk entirely. So these composite decking materials, typically made of a mix of PVC and wood fiber, usually pretty fire resistant and all around a lot more durable and long lasting than lumber. Also, these decking materials can be better for the environment when compared to the more common pressure treated boards. Those pressure treated boards can leach toxins into the environment over time, whereas these are more stable. We saw some on privacy fences and heard how the firefighters look at these things and they see a fuse or a wick often going right up to the home. These things are usually in Texas out baking in the sun day after day. Not a good situation. But like we heard, that wick can be interrupted using non-combustible materials to assemble pillars and break that fuel continuity. So here we see brick. You can also use materials like rock or wrought iron. So there's the structural hardening concepts around the property. Just implementing those that we've seen here, you've already drastically reduced the risk of wildfire harming the structure, and we haven't even gotten into the actual landscaping elements yet. But we will now. So this brings us to the idea of defensible space. This home in this picture survived the Steiner Ranch fire in 2011 thanks to an effective defensible space. You can see it's got very fuels around the home in that 30-foot area. We've got a nice lush green lawn that's not likely to catch on fire. So what is defensible space exactly? I describe it as a protective buffer around the building, typically 30 feet. We heard 30 feet today, and it goes outwards in all directions. That distance can vary depending on other factors, though. There's slope, there's your proximity to other properties, if you're in the WUI, if you're more in an urban setting. So you want to grow or shrink that 30 feet depending on these other factors. That defensible space area can be landscaped, but you really want to limit the flammable materials that are occupying that space. And this area is supposed to serve as a barrier to stop a wildfire from approaching, or in the case of falling embers, starting a new fire near the home. Also, if the home itself starts on fire, maybe there's a toaster malfunction, you want to stop the spread of fire working from the home outwards into the woods or to an adjacent property. On many of Austin's smaller lots, you might not have 30 feet before you bump into a property line. In that case, the effort should go out to the property line, and then at that point you want to pick up some collaboration, some communication with those adjacent neighbors, and that's where it can really start spreading, and you get the peer pressure thing going with other neighbors, and becomes more and more of a community-wide effort. So a lot of times people hear this term defensible space or Firewise landscaping, and it conjures up this image of a barren landscape just void of any vegetation at all. It's a parking lot. But this doesn't have to be true. You don't really need to cut down your trees and rip out all your plants to be safe from fire. Again, it's careful planning, diligent maintenance. You can offer your clients a healthy and beautiful landscape that serves to contain the fire instead of fuel it. Also in the lobby there, I'm not sure if anybody was able to pick one up, but we have a little poster. It's named Maintain a Defensible Space. And it does a good job of taking a lot of the information in this book and boiling it all down to just one poster size. So that also is the centerfold of this booklet. So looks like that. And free to take plenty of copies. That's also on our website. And that might be something a little bit easier for your clients to digest in a bite-sized piece instead of giving them a big booklet. So fuel continuity, we've heard of this concept. And in order to stop a fire from spreading to or from the home, it's important to limit the fuel continuity. We've heard the phrase, the right plant in the right place, and that really applies well to when you're looking at fuel continuity. And fuel continuity can be divided into looking at it from a horizontal perspective, or kind of like a plan view, and as well as a vertical perspective. So if you're standing there looking at those ladder fuels. To break up horizontal or lateral fuel continuity, one great technique is to establish groups of landscape islands where the plants and trees are isolated in beds and a safe distance from the home. You can also create fuel breaks with landscape features like this crushed rock path, stone walls, healthy and trimmed lawns can serve as fuel breaks, driveways. And to break up vertical fuel continuity, you want to create separation between surface fuels and then those tree canopies or the structures above. If you can prevent a surface fire from becoming a crown fire by limbing up trees, that way the lowest branches will be at least 6 feet high, 6 to 10 feet high, and you want to remove shrubs and other intermediate ladder fuels. Speaking with the fire department, I understand it's much, much easier to control a ground fire. Once it's up in the canopy, it's kind of a different ballgame. It's going to have a lot more ability to spread if that canopy is continuous like we see in this picture. So removing those ladder fuels goes a very long way. And then within wooded areas with a tall and closed canopy, you can create this kind of a shaded fuel break look. That's removing the ladder fuels, limbing up the trees. This method can be real effective at slowing or stopping the spread of fire if it's not already up in the canopies. And then within the canopies themselves, I generally recommend thinning the canopy, but kind of maintaining that canopy closure. When you thin it, you're reducing what they call like the bulk canopy density, or the amount of fuel that's up there. But maintaining that canopy closure, you can still get good shade coverage from that canopy, which is going to retain some moisture down at the ground level. So like we've heard earlier, trees located in the defensible space and around the property can be retained, but we just need to practice some extra caution if they are retained. So the tree limbs really shouldn't be overhanging or touching the structures, and removal of the ladder fuels underneath the tree canopy becomes more important than ever if it's located in that defensible space. So that first 30 feet, if you want to retain a prized tree, I like to consider the tree then as part of the footprint, kind of the structure itself that you're protecting. So the tree kind of becomes an extension of the home. Then you want to extend that 30 feet or that defensible space buffer out beyond that tree as well. So we saw a couple of good examples on how to break up that fuel continuity. Here's some bad examples. This is that classic ladder fuel condition where a small ground fire can jump up into the canopy just within seconds. And here we see fuels that are so continuous that it's really hard to tell where the vegetative fuels end and the structural fuels begin. Of course, in this type of situation, a fire is not going to distinguish between vegetation or structural. It's just going to keep on burning. And topography can play a big factor in creating an effective defensible space. We've heard a little bit about this already. Homes located on top of a slope or on a slope are at greater fire risk because that fire likes to burn uphill. It burns a lot faster uphill. It likes to move in that direction. In these situations, defensible space can extend out a little further in the downslope direction, and some more aggressive vegetation management should probably be taken in that direction as well. Building a retaining wall out of non-combustible materials on the downslope edge of the defensible space can be very effective at preventing the spread of wildfire. And this picture was taken at the Oak Hill fire site in that neighborhood in 2011, and this stone retaining wall very likely saved this home from burning. And on the contrary, we see a vegetated slope here. This situation, of course, looks very risky, going to the looks like unenclosed deck space below. We've got a pretty old-looking, dried-out wooden deck with the fine grasses and shrubs providing those continuous fuels right to it. So what about Firewise plants? You all may have come here today kind of hoping to leave with a nice list of different plant species with them all ranked from least flammable to most flammable, but I hate to tell you, I don't think you're going to leave with that kind of list today. And there's pretty good reason for that. We don't want to put that list in anybody's hands because of the false sense of security that might come out of that. No plant at all is fireproof, and all plants are going to burn under extreme fire conditions. So instead of giving you a list, we'll talk a little bit about some of the plant characteristics that make one plant more flammable than another. And first is a plant's moisture content. It's the single most important factor governing its flammability. Succulents are an excellent example because they retain water in their leaves and stems, and they're generally considered to have real low plant flammability. And then on the other hand, plants with a high concentration of oil, wax, resin, that type of thing, they're generally going to be more volatile and burn more intensely. So examples of those would include your conifers, cedars, ash juniper, rosemary, yopon holly, agarita. And if these plants are desired in the landscape, that's fine, but you just want to put them outside of that initial defensible space buffer. So outside that 30 feet range is going to be much more appropriate. And this rosemary hedge in front of the big window, not a good way to keep fire out of the home. Also, Firewise plants, they don't accumulate or shed large amounts of litter, leaves, fine branches. That material can burn real easily when dry, of course. This one looks particularly dangerous, stuffed up under the roof there. I think that's a pampas grass. And then, of course, we like to preach that native and adapted plants that are well suited to our local climate, they're more likely to survive. A living plant is a lot harder to burn than a dead plant. And then another good Firewise plant characteristic is slow growing. They're easier to keep up with and maintain, so slow growing is good. And then it's important to keep a landscape well irrigated as those watering restrictions allow. I think our watering restrictions are still allowing hand watering, so there's always that option. But during the most extreme droughts and when the watering restrictions really kick into high gear, owners can prioritize their plants that they wish to save and provide that supplemental water to the plants that are nearest the home first, provide that higher level of protection, and then maybe let the ones farther out go. All right, now moving on to some of the regulatory ideas that should be applied to certain Firewise landscaping techniques. We've moved on to the black background, so you know we're getting serious. So as a watershed protection employee, I'm going to start off with waterways. That's going to include your streams, creeks, rivers, lakes. I often get called by concerned citizens who feel that the wild vegetation along a creek presents a severe fire hazard. And that makes a lot of sense. Look at this picture. It's got a lot going on in there. But studies have actually shown that riparian woodlands have a lower ignition potential than those upland areas. And the riparian areas can serve as a fire break. This is mostly because these areas have lower grass fuel loads, less fine fuels. higher soil moisture and air humidity, lower temperatures, and lower wind speeds. So these characteristics go a long way to reduce fire occurrences. And then, of course, riparian vegetation offers a wealth of other environmental benefits, like stabilizing creek banks, filtering pollutants from stormwater runoff. And city code regulates the removal of vegetation within defined setbacks around certain creeks. These are like buffers around waterways. And I'm not sure who's familiar with this tool, but it's the city's online development web map viewer. You can find this easily. Just Google City of Austin GIS, and it pops right up. There's a whole bunch of layers in there that are handy, this being one of them that shows the waterway setbacks. So the dark blue there is what we call the critical water quality zone. The light blue is the water quality transition zone. And vegetation removal beyond just basic yard work. If you're doing like a fuel mitigation project, something more significant, you would want to coordinate through the city's Development Assistance Center or directly through the Watershed Protection Department. You could call me directly if you want to make sure that those activities are in compliance. So the width of those buffers from the center line of a creek, they vary. Could be nothing, or it can go all the way up to a maximum of 200 feet. It just depends on the type of waterway. Is it an urban or a rural waterway? Is it water supply? And also the upstream contributing drainage area to that point will dictate the width of those protective buffers. Also, there's another handout at the table there that speaks specifically to the wildfire risk near Austin's creeks. Next are the critical environmental features, or CEFs. These include wetlands, springs, caves and recharge features, karst features, rim rock, bluffs, like cliff-like features. And these also have protective buffers around them, typically 150 feet, but it can also vary, give or take, depending on some other circumstances. These features are also shown on the city's online web GIS viewer that I showed you. So this area that I'm using as an example is near the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. And it might be a little bit tricky to see, but there's these tan polygons kind of speckled all over the map, and those are setbacks from critical environmental features. And if you drill down into the different layers on that viewer, you can see what the feature is. Is it a wetland, or is it a rim rock feature, or something along those lines? These are just the documented, the known features. So if you're working on a property and you're not too sure if you're coming across a CEF, you can always contact us and we can come out and evaluate and help you do that. So around critical environmental features, we recommend establishing in that buffer zone some native vegetation, usually grasses. While that's not the most fire-wise, these features are by development rules already set away from structures, so that usually doesn't pose a real imminent hazard to the structure themselves. All right, so property limits. When working to reduce those fire risks, you got to stay on the property that you're working on, whether it's your own or clients. No matter how intimidating that forest thicket on the other side of the fence in the preserve looks, it's important to know where property lines are and to respect those boundaries. Property owners and their agents can be held liable for costs and mitigating damages to other properties, as well as facing legal action for trespassing. So I always want to remind folks to respect those property limits. But that opens up this opportunity, again, for collaborating with neighbors to address wildfire risks at a larger community scale. That's an excellent way to collectively reduce risk and raise awareness, and this approach may also help you find new clients. Once a community begins working together, they may wish to develop a local community wildfire protection plan, or even pursuing recognition as a Firewise community. This could be like a jackpot opportunity for landscapers too, tapping into that. So if there's concerns about fire risks on adjacent public lands, like a nearby nature preserve, the BMP's booklet includes a list of common agencies that manage local wildland areas to facilitate that communication and that collaboration. Talk a little bit about threatened and endangered species. The unique environment here in Travis County is home to about 25 threatened and endangered species, such as the golden cheek warbler shown in this picture. There's also another bird, the black-capped vireo, and a whole suite of cave-dwelling bugs and salamanders. There's several preserve systems in Austin that are set up to protect critical habitat for these animals, and it's not uncommon for that protected habitat to extend across property lines and onto private property. But it's important for homeowners and landscapers to understand that even on private property, that habitat, if it is threatened and endangered species habitat, it's still protected even on private property. And of all the threatened and endangered species that we have in the Austin area, the golden cheek warbler shown here is probably the one that's most likely to interfere with vegetation management plans. It only breeds here in central Texas, and its habitat is characterized by mature ash juniper mixed with a mix of oaks and some other hardwood deciduous trees. So we see that vegetation community occurring a lot, particularly in the west part of Travis County. But fortunately, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service released a set of guidelines that allows folks to treat vegetation within the protected habitat. There's a link in the booklet if you want to take a look at that, if you need that information. And when that's put into practice, it resembles kind of that shaded field break look that we saw earlier. It's a lot of understory thinning, limbing things up, removing that fine understory growth, ladder fuels, but retaining the canopy. And I've spoken with biologists that study this bird in particular, and it's pretty interesting and exciting to learn that treatment, they've studied how the bird responds to that treatment the following year when it comes back, and they're saying that it actually enhances that habitat. The bird population numbers increase in those areas, and their breeding practices are more successful with more successful reproduction. One very important note on those treatment specifications from U.S. Fish and Wildlife is that no work can be done within the habitat during the bird's breeding season. So you can see that is between March and August. Fortunately, that aligns well with the oak wilt season, which we'll probably be hearing more from when the city arborist speaks after lunch. But just wanted to show that correlation here where oak wilt, there's a lot of oaks in the golden cheek warbler habitat. So these areas, you would want to target vegetation management activities in the fall and winter months to avoid both oak wilt and the warbler breeding. Yes?
We talked about pruning up trees. How far up are you talking? Everything you've shown is like really, really high, excluding like, I don't know, Texas redbuds and things like that, like your understory.
Yeah, I think it just goes back to looking at it as far as fuel continuity goes. You would just want things with spacing. So the numbers I've heard for pruning up trees to what's deemed safe, I see 6 to 10 feet a lot. But again, if you prune a redbud to 6 to 10 feet, it's not going to work. So I think a redbud, of course, would be fine if the area around it was cleared and it was isolated. Maybe have some, small little flowers and a bed below it or something like that. But you just want to limit that fuel continuity again.
See, the thing is that the woodlands around here in the hill country and in a naturally is occurring, the reason why the golden tree warbler prefers it being pruned up is because within the anatomy of a healthy woodland is actually very open, and they're able to therefore fly around freely. But that the edges of all these woodlands are very, very thick with shrubs and all that. They go all the way to the ground. And like Chuck Sexton with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has noticed that when fires are burning through the grasslands, when they come up to this vegetation green that goes all the way to the ground, literally acts as a fire break and doesn't go into the trees. Unfortunately, a lot of people are pruning up these edges so the fire and the grasses therefore go into the tree, into the woodland, and that's how the fire gets in there. I guess I'm trying to get at here is if there's a way to kind of do that in a yard within even the 30-foot limit, because I'm just seeing this really lunar
Yeah, and I can understand your concerns.
Adaptations could be incorporated to increase the diversity.
I think it's a trick, applying these techniques in a way has that still that aesthetic appeal that looks natural, but right. Specifically about wildfire habitat and how that can work in tandem with these Firewise techniques. I haven't seen a presentation so specific on that topic before, so I'm excited to see that and see what Meredith has to say. But it is a trick, and I think just being judicious and just imagining how the fire would travel across the landscape can go a long way at cutting off those fuses, those wicks, that continuity. So I'm trying to apply that to your example of a grassland encroaching into a heavily wooded area, and how to block that from happening. And it's a tough one. I would probably defer to some of our wildland management agencies. Again, not a more direct answer on how to manage that. Okay. Okay, one more ordinance here is the Hill Country Roadway Corridor Ordinance. This is regulated by the Development Services Department, and it applies to properties within 1,000 feet along a few specific roadways in Austin. And it's my understanding that if a property is within one of these corridors, any portion of the property, that the entire property is subject to the requirements of the ordinance. So the roadways that are covered and the properties that come up to those roadways are Southwest Parkway, Highway 360, Bee Caves Road 2222, and parts of 620. And then those properties have a requirement to designate natural areas where 40% of that site has to be set aside, not developed, and the vegetation management activities that are allowed in those areas are limited. We have had some adjustments to those policies recently to where the dead and down material in the designated natural areas can be removed, and it's my understanding that we're now allowed to remove ladder fuels up to 4 feet in those areas. But you'd probably want to go coordinate through, again, maybe the Development Assistance Center on a case-by-case basis when working in these areas to make sure that activities are in compliance. That 40% natural area must include an initial 50-foot setback from the roadway. So most times that 50-foot setback won't cover your entire 40%, but it has to include that 50-foot setback. The intent of all this is to preserve the scenic vistas that can be enjoyed while driving down these roadways, and not to clutter them with visible storefronts and manicured landscaping. So again, the online GIS web viewer shows those areas, and you can see exactly which properties might be affected by the ordinance. It's very hard to see there, but there's a kind of a light blue lines over those roadways that I mentioned. Also, if you are working on a property that's under the Hill Country Roadway Ordinance and you want to see exactly where those natural areas were set aside, you can contact the city or the property owner and view the site plan that'll show those areas delineated, and you can have an understanding of where your limitations might be. All right, so brush disposal is a big one. Creating and maintaining a Firewise landscape can quickly generate a lot of this brushy waste that requires disposal. Once cut, the material can pose even a greater fire hazard if it's not stored and disposed of correctly. I'll go over a few of the options, but I am curious because I'm really not aware. Can anyone tell me where professional landscapers usually dispose of this material? Is it usually landfilled, or is anybody willing to chime in on where that vegetative woody materials is disposed of or taken after leaving a client's? Yes. Okay, great. That's okay.
I think Austin Mead's landfill is about $85
Okay, great. That's wonderful insight. I did a little bit of research to prepare these, to prepare this information, and was finding similar notes. I wasn't successful in finding a real list of companies that are able to recycle that material. I found one, Organics by Gosh is another one that I learned, and I think their rates are about $15 per trailer as well. So I think that's one of the best ways, and I would encourage folks to use those types of avenues. We talked about throwing it over the back fence. That is a huge wildfire risk. So not only is that unsafe, it's also a form of illegal dumping. That can be a fine of up to $2,000, believe it or not. Usually when we come across this on an initial offense, we'll work to educate the homeowner or the responsible party and prevent it from happening again. But then on future offenses, that's when things can get a little bit more legally involved. So certainly don't want to see that. That's not a disposal method. How about burning it in a pit? This, they've got a cleared area around here. It's a decent distance away from the trees and structures. There's even some rocks bordering the pit. But no, that's not open burning of brush in Austin city limits is not allowed. Certainly not a appropriate disposal method any time of year. So you can't throw it over the fence. You can't burn it. How can you get rid of this stuff? Well, for residents, and this probably doesn't apply as well to landscapers because I don't believe that you'd want to leave your clients with any of the material, but something I recommend often to Austin residents is to take advantage, of course, of the city's just the weekly brush collection. They will accept limbs up to 5 feet long and 3 inches in diameter. Then that's taken to Hornsby Bend where they mulch it and they will turn it into dillo dirt, so it's got a beneficial reuse. And then for the bigger stuff, Austin Resource Recovery also has the 2 times a year large brush collections. And it's a great idea for residents if they're going to be doing any big Firewise landscaping efforts to try to sync that up with their large brush pickup schedule. So if your landscaping services are really taking off and you're really doing well with this Firewise stuff, generating a lot of woody debris, you might be able to invest in one of these chippers. I think they're pretty pricey, but it makes the material so much easier to haul off site. It can even be recycled on site, but like we heard during the virtual home assessments, you just want to be careful because, of course, mulch is flammable too. We don't want it too thick, and keeping it outside of that defensible space wouldn't be a bad idea. You could always use alternate, like the decomposed granite as a mulch that's within that defensible space or up against the home. All right, and here we get to kind of the hauling off sites and the recycling options. This is one of the safest options. Just get it out of there promptly. So the one I'm most familiar with is the Organics by Gosh. They're out east on FM 969, and again, it's $15 a trailer load, so it sounds like that might be kind of the going rate. And when compared to a landfill, it's cheaper, and it's going towards a beneficial reuse and not just taking up room in the landfill. Also, this wouldn't apply to professional businesses, but for homeowners, you can take, I think, any amount of brush to the city's Resource Recovery Center on Todd Lane. They accept it free of charge, and then they'll chip it into mulch, and they provide that mulch free to anybody that wants it. I think that would include professional businesses if you have a need for mulch. Then there is the landfill option. There's a couple of local community landfills shown here. It's not the most environmentally friendly method, but it is legal. And then this is something important for professional landscapers to be aware of if you're hauling brush and debris away for your clients. The Austin Code Department set up this program a few years ago to cut down on illegal dumping. It is called the Private Waste Hauler License. So this is actually required for anybody that's hauling a waste, whether it's vegetative debris or just a bunch of junk, for as a service. So this license, I think initially it might have been free, but today, I went back a couple days ago and looked, and it's $100 per year now for each hauling vehicle. And then there's small surcharges for these containers too. So there are fines and violations for hauling material without this, so it's something that you might want to check out if you're not already aware of it. And then if a homeowner or somebody uses a waste hauler that's not licensed and their waste ends up improperly disposed at the back of a dark cul-de-sac or something, they'll be held liable also for that as an illegal dumping penalty if they don't have the sticker. So it's important for homeowners to be checking for that as well. And the Austin Code Department's website has a list of everybody that is already licensed and registered. Okay, so that wraps up my presentation. If anybody has any more questions, I think we're running a little short on time, but I'd be happy to take any questions now, or you can grab me during lunch. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Ryan. We are now adjourned for lunch. Please return here by 1:15. Throughout lunch today, please partake of your lunch outside of this room, but throughout the hour and 15-minute lunch break, we'll be having a video that will be playing. It's basically landscape, land and balance, and what it is more like kind of tying in with the prescribed fire and what the fire service is doing for us to become professional landscapers on our side of the fence. So, anyway, we'll see you back at 1:15. Thank you very much.